Imagine the sensation of a single drop of ice-cold rain sliding down the back of your neck at 3 o'clock in the morning. You're lying on the bare earth, and the dampness of the soil is slowly leaching the heat directly out of your hip bones. There is no thermostat to turn up, no deadbolt to slide into place, and no drywall to buffer the low, guttural huff of a predator moving through the tall grass just 20 feet away. How exactly did humans survive like this for over 99% of our history before the first house was ever built? How did we manage to keep our core temperatures from plummeting into a fatal chill every single night? And why, when every other creature on the planet seems to have a built-in suit of fur or a shell, did we decide to face the raw elements with nothing but our own bare, vulnerable skin? It feels like an impossible riddle. We are the only hairless, soft-bodied, slow-moving primates that decided to conquer every climate on Earth without bringing a roof with us. To understand how we did it, we have to stop looking at the house as a pile of bricks and start looking at it as an evolutionary strategy that began inside our own cells long before it ever became a blueprint. Because the truth is, your first house wasn't made of wood or stone. It was a biological furnace that you carry with you every second of the day. But if our bodies were so good at keeping us alive, why did we ever feel the need to build a single wall? And what was the very first thing we constructed that finally separated us from the rest of the animal kingdom? The answer begins with a number that most of us never think about: 80 watts. That is the approximate amount of heat your resting body radiates into the world at any given moment, which is roughly the same output as an old-fashioned incandescent light bulb. This is your first unseen barrier against the cold, a metabolic shell of heat that radiates outward. But here is the problem that haunted our ancestors for millions of years. Heat is a restless traveler. It always wants to move from where it's hot to where it's cold. In a world without houses, your body is in a constant, high-stakes negotiation with the atmosphere to keep those 80 watts from escaping. We survived by becoming the most sophisticated thermal engineers in the animal kingdom, but we didn't do it by growing thick coats of wool. Instead, we did something much more counterintuitive. We stripped off our fur and developed the most advanced cooling system on the planet, the eccrine sweat gland. This might seem like a strange way to survive before houses, but this cooling system is what allowed us to hunt in the midday sun when every other predator was forced to hide in the shade. It gave us the thermal high ground. But this invisible shell of sweat and metabolic heat creates a massive vulnerability. What happens when the sun goes down and that high-performance cooling system becomes a liability? How did we stop the environment from reclaiming our heat the moment we closed our eyes to sleep? And more importantly, how did we prevent the tiny, invisible killers, the parasites and bacteria of the forest floor, from invading our bodies while we were most defenseless? This brings us to our first major technological leap, and it's one that we can actually date by looking at the DNA of a tiny, skin-crawling insect. Scientists like David Reed have spent years studying the evolution of the body louse, Pediculus humanus corporus. This is a creature that cannot live on a head or in fur. It can only survive in the folds of human clothing. By tracking when the body louse split from its cousin, the head louse, researchers have estimated that humans began wearing portable houses, otherwise known as clothes, somewhere around 170,000 years ago. This was the first time we successfully uncoupled our survival from our biology. We didn't have to wait a million years for evolution to give us a thick hide. We simply took the hide of something else and wrapped it around our own heat. This leather shell became our first mobile wall, a microclimate that stayed at a steady temperature regardless of whether we were in a cave or a clearing. But even with a leather wrap, the ground remained a cold, hard enemy. If you've ever gone camping without a sleeping pad, you know that the earth is a heat sink that will drain the life out of you faster than the air ever will. So, if we had the heat and we had the clothes, what was the next layer of the shell? How did we solve the problem of the cold, damp earth? And what was the specific engineering breakthrough that allowed us to finally stop sleeping like animals and start sleeping like humans? To find that answer, we have to look into the dust of Sibutu Cave in South Africa. This is where archaeologist Lynn Wadley discovered something that fundamentally changes our understanding of human comfort. About 77,000 years ago, long before the first pyramid or even the first permanent hut, humans were already master interior designers. They weren't just tossing a few handfuls of grass on the floor, they were engineering complex, multi-layered mattresses. Wadley found evidence of sedges and grasses, specifically the Cryptocarya woodii or Cape laurel, being laid down in thick mats. But here is the wow factor. The Cape laurel contains specific chemical compounds that act as a natural insecticide. Our ancestors weren't just making the floor soft, they were using botanical chemistry to create a chemical shell that repelled mosquitoes and flies that carry lethal diseases. They even regularly burned their old bedding to reset the hygiene of their sleeping area, a prehistoric version of changing the sheets. This was a sophisticated, knowledge-based system of living that provided the same benefits as a modern sealed bedroom: protection from cold, moisture, and disease-bearing pests. But even with a chemical-shielded bed and a leather coat, there was still the problem of the massive, four-legged shadows moving in the dark. How did we keep the saber-toothed cats and the giant hyenas of the Pleistocene at bay when we had no doors to lock? Was fire really the only thing keeping us from being a midnight snack? Or was there a social shell that was even more powerful than the flame? The mystery of our survival against predators often centers on fire, and for good reason. Controlled fire use, which some evidence at sites like Wonderwork Cave suggests could go back as far as 1,000,000 years, provided a literal circle of safety. But fire is a fickle protector. It requires fuel, it requires a guard, and it can go out. The deeper secret to how we survived without walls lies in something called the sentinel hypothesis. If you look at how modern hunter-gatherer groups like the Hadza sleep, you'll notice something strange. Everyone has a different internal clock. Some people are natural larks who wake up at 4 a.m., while others are owls who stay awake until midnight. Researchers like Charlie Nunn have suggested that this wasn't an accident. It was an evolutionary shell of vigilance. In a group of 20 people, there is almost never a moment when everyone is in a deep, unresponsive sleep at the exact same time. We survived because we used each other as biological motion detectors. Our walls were the ears and eyes of our tribal mates. This social shell meant that a predator didn't just have to sneak past a fire. It had to sneak past a rotating shift of semi-conscious humans who were hardwired to jump to full alertness at the snap of a twig. But as effective as this was, it still didn't provide shelter from a torrential downpour or a screaming blizzard. At what point did we stop relying on our internal heat and our social group and start actually bending the physical world to create the first architectural shells? And what was the specific toolkit that allowed a hairless ape to build a structure that could withstand a storm? The transition to actual construction is much older than most people realize, and it didn't start with stone. It started with the physics of tension and compression. At a site called Terra Amida in France, dating back nearly 400,000 years, archaeologists found something startling: post holes. These were the imprints of sturdy branches that had been pushed into the sand in an oval shape and leaned together to form a conical or dome-like shell. These weren't permanent homes, but they were sophisticated weather shields. They used the same principle as a modern tent: a rigid skeleton covered by a flexible skin of brush or hides. This was the moment the invisible shell became a physical one. By creating an enclosed space, we were finally able to trap those 80 watts of body heat and create a pocket of air that stayed 5 to 10 degrees warmer than the outside world. This envelope of air is the fundamental principle of every house ever built, and we mastered it hundreds of thousands of years before the first city. But why, if we were so good at building these temporary shelters, do we find so much evidence of humans living in caves? Was the caveman a reality? Or have we been misled by the fact that stone preserves history better than wood does? And if we were building huts in the open, how did we decide where the perfect spot was? Was there a prehistoric version of real estate? The reality of the caveman is largely a trick of archaeology. Caves are great at protecting artifacts from the wind and rain, so we find a lot of stuff in them. But for most of our history, a cave was less like a house and more like a high-value fortress that we visited only when the weather became truly apocalyptic. Most of the time, we were out in the landscape, and our survival depended on our ability to read the terrain for its natural shell-like properties. We looked for rock overhangs that could act as a roof without trapping smoke. We looked for microclimates, valleys that stayed warm or ridges that broke the wind. A group of ancient humans didn't just walk until they were tired, they moved through the world looking for shelter-adjacent features. This is what's known as site selection, and it's a form of environmental intelligence that we have almost completely lost. They knew which way the wind blew in February and which trees had the densest canopies for rain protection. But as the climate of the Earth began to swing into the brutal extremes of the last ice age, even the best site selection wasn't enough. How did humans manage to live in the subarctic tundra of Russia and Ukraine 15,000 years ago, where there were no trees for wood and the ground was frozen solid? What do you build a shell out of when the world is nothing but ice and grass? The answer is both macabre and magnificent. We used the bones of giants. In places like Meshurik, Ukraine, researchers found structures built entirely from the bones of woolly mammoths. Imagine a house where the foundation is made of mammoth mandibles, the walls are a lattice of ribs, and the roof is supported by massive tusks draped in heavy hides. This was the mammoth shell, and it represents the pinnacle of pre-agricultural engineering. These weren't just piles of bone. They were organized, aesthetic structures. Some used over 149 individual mammoths to build a single dwelling. They were heavy enough to resist Arctic gales and thick enough to hold the heat of a central hearth for hours. This was the moment the human shell became a permanent statement. We weren't just hiding from the environment anymore, we were dominating it. But this leads to a haunting question. If we could survive the ice age in bone huts and hide-wrapped shelters, why did we ever stop? Why did we trade our mobile, flexible, and surprisingly healthy lifestyle for the permanent, cramped, and often disease-ridden early cities? Did the house make us stronger, or did it actually make us more fragile? And as we moved behind thick walls of stone and brick, what did we lose in that invisible shell of knowledge that had kept us alive for millions of years? When we finally made the leap to permanent housing during the Neolithic Revolution about 10,000 years ago, the trade-off was immediate and severe. The social shell of the small, vigilant band began to fracture as we moved into larger, anonymous settlements. The chemical shell of our medicinal bedding was replaced by stagnant floors where livestock and humans lived in close proximity, leading to the first great plagues in human history. We became taller in our houses, but our bones became thinner. We were safer from the tiger, but we were more vulnerable to the flu, the flea, and the tax collector. The house allowed us to accumulate stuff, but it also anchored us to a single point on the map, making us vulnerable to droughts and wars that our mobile ancestors could have simply walked away from. We survived before houses because we were part of the landscape, not separate from it. Our skin was our first wall, our fire was our first heater, and our tribe was our first security system. We were a species of 80-watt light bulbs moving through a dark, cold world, and we thrived because we knew how to weave those tiny glows together into a sun that never went out. But now, as we sit in our climate-controlled boxes, have we forgotten how to be that light? Think back to that sensation of the ice-cold rain on your neck. For our ancestors, that wasn't a reason to despair, it was a data point. It was a prompt to tighten the leather wrap, to add a branch to the fire, or to move closer to the person sleeping next to them. They survived because they were masters of a million tiny adjustments. They didn't need a house to feel at home in the world because they had turned their own biology and their own social bonds into a fortress. Today, we have the most advanced houses in history, yet we often feel more isolated and more anxious than the people sleeping in the mammoth bone huts. Does the fact that we can no longer survive a single night in the woods without a bag full of gear mean we've won the battle against nature? Or does it mean we've lost the very things that made us human? If the power went out and the walls vanished tomorrow, how many of us would know which leaf kills a mosquito or which way the wind will turn at midnight? We've traded the invisible, unbreakable shell of ancestral knowledge for a fragile shell of glass and steel. When you really look at it, the history of the human house isn't a story of progress so much as it is a story of insulation. We have insulated ourselves from the cold, yes, but we have also insulated ourselves from the raw, electric reality of being alive. Our ancestors survived because they had to be hyper-aware of every breeze and every shadow. They were more connected to the world than we will ever be, precisely because they had no walls to stand between them and the truth of the earth. They were the masters of the 80-watt furnace, the engineers of the aromatic bed, and the keepers of the sentinel sleep. They lived in a world where the only thing between you and the void was the strength of your hands and the loyalty of your friends. And maybe that's the most chilling realization of all. The house didn't just protect us from the elements. It protected us from the terrifying, beautiful necessity of needing each other to stay warm. We built houses to survive the cold, but in doing so, we might have accidentally created a different kind of chill, one that no furnace can ever truly touch. The next time you hear a storm rattling your window panes, I want you to ask yourself a question. If these walls weren't here, who would you be sleeping next to keep warm? Whose 80-watt light bulb would be the only thing keeping you from the dark? It's a strange thing to realize that the sturdier our houses became, the more we allowed our own internal survival systems to atrophy. We are the architects of our own comfort, but that comfort is a gilded cage. We've traded the vibrant, dangerous freedom of the open world for the safety of a box. And as the world outside continues to change, as the climates shift and the storms grow stronger, we have to wonder if our permanent walls are actually a solution, or if they've just made us the most vulnerable version of ourselves to ever exist. Our ancestors survived for 300,000 years without a single brick. Could we survive 30 days? It's a haunting thought to end on, but it's one that forces us to look at our modern lives with a bit more perspective. We aren't just people who live in houses. We are the descendants of the ultimate survivors, the ones who could look at a pile of mammoth bones or a handful of Cape Laurel leaves and see a sanctuary. That invisible shell is still there, buried deep in your den, waiting for the moment the lights go out. But until that day comes, we just keep building the walls thicker, higher, and tighter, trying to drown out the sound of the wind that used to be our only music. If you found this dive into our deep past as fascinating as I did, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. If you had to build a shelter today using only what's in a 5-mile radius of your current location, what would your shell be made of? Would it be stone, wood, or something else entirely? I'm genuinely curious to see how much of that ancient site selection knowledge is still rattling around in our modern brains. And if you want to keep exploring the hidden layers of our history, feel free to join us for the next one. There are plenty more rabbit holes to go down. Because at the end of the day, when the sun dips below the horizon and the temperature begins to drop, that 80-watt glow is still all you really have. We can pile up as many bricks as we want, but the cold is patient. It remembers a time when you didn't have a roof. It remembers the damp soil and the ice-cold rain on the back of your neck. And it knows that, eventually, every house returns to the earth, leaving only the bare, shivering skin of the creature that was once brave enough to call the whole world home. That drop of rain is still there, waiting in the dark, a chilling reminder that your walls are only as strong as the ancient, invisible shell you've forgotten you even have.